On the afternoon of June 26, 1943, the wind over RAF Manston came in low and steady off the channel, carrying the smell of salt and fuel across a field lined with squat, broad-shouldered fighters that looked more like engine blocks with wings than sleek combat aircraft. The ground crews moved around them with the quiet efficiency of men who had done this too many times to count. Fuel hoses coupling with a hollow thunk, ammo belts dragged from crates and threaded into the wings, hydraulic fluid staining coveralls and the concrete beneath their boots. Near the far end of the line, a P-47 Thunderbolt sat with its cowl open, metal skin glinting dull aluminum under the cloudy Kent sky. On the fuselage, just ahead of the tail, someone had painted a nickname in neat letters, Half Pint. The squadron code was HVP, 61st Fighter Squadron, 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack. The men liked to say it with a trace of pride. Wikipedia. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson stood on the wing root, one hand on the cockpit rim, helmet hanging by its strap from his fingers. He was 23 years old, Oklahoma farm boy shoulders filling out his flight jacket, eyes taking in the sky with that small, habitual squint of a man who lived between horizon and canopy frame. The briefing had been simple enough. 48 P-47Cs to launch from Manston as a forward strip, link up with B-17s returning from a strike on the Villacoublay airfield near Paris, and shepherd them home across the channel. The bombers would be tired, their formations ragged. German fighters would be waiting around the rendezvous point near Forges-les-Eaux, looking for stragglers. The Thunderbolt's job was to make sure they paid for every attempt. Wikipedia. Johnson lowered himself into the cockpit. The seat was a steel bucket with a slab of armor plate behind it, cold through his flight suit. It was a reassuring weight, an inch of hardened metal between his spine and whatever the Germans sent their way. He pulled the harness over his shoulders, clicked the buckles home, and reached for the familiar levers and switches. Battery on, magnetos, fuel selector. The R-2800 radial coughed, spat fire from the exhaust stubs, then settled into a heavy, barrel-chested rumble that vibrated through the airframe and up his legs. Wikipedia. Taxi, run-up, final check. On the signal, the Thunderbolts rolled, each one taking a long breath of runway before lifting its 8-ton bulk into the air. Wheels folded, flaps up. The squadron formed into a broad, climbing curve out over the glittering strip of water that separated England from occupied France. At altitude, the world narrowed. Canopy frame, wing leading edge, the small circle of gun sight glass floating in front of his nose. Out ahead, contrails of the B-17s smeared pale lines across the upper sky, drifting west. Below them, the green and brown of Normandy and Picardy, cut by roads and hedgerows, a landscape Johnson had seen only from this distance, a map of fields and small towns he knew in names from briefing boards and casualty lists. Radio chatter crackled low and clipped in his headset. Position calls. Fuel checks. Somewhere above the contrails and behind the sun, the Luftwaffe was climbing too. The rendezvous point came up almost casually. There, off the nose, were the bombers, fat, four-engined fortresses shedding altitude, formation slightly ragged, but still impressive. Their silver undersides flashed in the late afternoon light. The Thunderbolts slid into place around them like heavy, pugnacious shepherd dogs. For a few minutes, nothing happened. Then someone's voice on the radio, flat and tight. "Bandits, high 12 coming down." Johnson craned his neck and caught it. A string of dots diving out of the thin upper cloud, each one growing, sprouting wings. Then the distinctive silhouette resolved. Focke-Wulf 190s, 16 at least, rolled inverted and dropping in on the P-47s from above and behind. Wikipedia. The first pass hit like an invisible hammer. Tracers cut through the formation, thunderbolts scattered, men yanking their sticks over to avoid mid-air collisions, and cannon fire at the same time. Johnson pushed the throttle to the stop. felt the big radial surge, heard himself curse as he tried to keep station and not get in anyone's line of fire. He never saw the first burst that hit him. One moment he was checking 6, scanning for a 190 lining up on his tail. The next, the entire aircraft shuddered under a series of blows that felt like someone taking a sledgehammer to the fuselage. Something crashed through the canopy frame. Glass exploded inward. The cockpit filled with the sting of burning metal and the smell of hot hydraulic fluid. A slug of metal clipped the tip of his nose. The world flashed white. For an instant, he thought he'd lost his eyes. Then vision came back in kaleidoscope fragments through a windscreen smeared with fluid and oil. His right leg went numb, where shrapnel had driven through the side of the cockpit. Wikipedia. The nose dropped. The horizon tilted and vanished. Half Pint rolled onto her back and went into a spinning, flaming fall toward the French countryside. Johnson grabbed the stick with both hands. The controls felt slack, mushy, like wires in a machine that had been half cut. Through the roar and the howl, he heard his own breathing, loud in the oxygen mask. The altimeter unwound. He tried the canopy release. The handle moved, but the frame above his head shifted only a few inches, then jammed solid. The metal behind him had been twisted by one of the cannon shells. The track that should have let the canopy slide back was now warped steel. He was trapped in a burning, tumbling 8-ton coffin. Wikipedia. There was a moment, brief, ordinary, clear, when the thought came with the same flat tone as the radio call. If you're getting out, you're doing it now. He pushed at the canopy again. It didn't budge. Smoke curled around his face. The aircraft spun, the G-forces pressing him sideways into the armor plate. Fine, he muttered to nobody. Then we're going home together. He kicked hard on the left rudder, feeling for some response through the crippled hydraulics. The spin flattened, then hesitated. He eased the stick forward, then back, coaxing what was left of the P-47's wounded airframe back toward level flight. The fire guttered and died as the airflow changed. The altimeter was still unwinding, but slower. The sea lay to the northwest, invisible beyond the stained canopy. A promise more than a sight. Somewhere behind him, unseen against the sun, a single WWII 190 rolled back into the attack. In the ready room of a Luftwaffe field in northern France that same day, maps had been laid out on a table under the tired glare of electric bulbs. Cigarette smoke hung in the air, with the faint tang of aviation fuel that seeped in from outside. The officers of WWII Jagdgeschwader 26 bent over the charts, tracing lines from their base to the expected path of the returning American bombers. To the men in that room, the map of the Channel coast was familiar territory. Since 1941, JG-26 had been the defense of the Reich along this stretch of sky, meeting RAF Spitfires and now American heavy bombers with the stub-winged Focke-Wulf 190, the Werger, the Butcher Bird, fast and heavily armed with 20mm cannon and machine guns. Wikipedia. They knew the rumors about the new American fighter, the P-47. It was big, they all agreed. Too big. Pilots joked that it looked like a milk churn with wings. When it first appeared, some had mistaken it for a bomber. The intelligence notes on one wall described it as heavy, fast in a dive, clumsy in a climb. A Thunderbolt that caught a 190 unaware could be dangerous, but few in the room believed the Americans would ever match the fluid, turn-fighting lethality of their own experts. The assumptions ran deeper than technical specs. In the Luftwaffe's early years, German fighter pilots had been the spearhead of blitzkrieg, trained hard, flying hundreds of combat hours, killing and surviving in a system built to produce individual aces and keep them at the front indefinitely. The men looked at the figures from 1939-41 and saw vindication. Long victory columns, names of comrades promoted and decorated for dozens, sometimes hundreds, of kills. Warhistory.org. By mid-1943, the reality under those numbers had begun to shift, but belief lagged behind. Training hours for new pilots had been cut again and again as fuel grew scarce and the demand for replacements soared. Men arrived at frontline units with barely half the flying time their predecessors had enjoyed. Yet the culture of the Jagdwaffe still held to the early war myth: genius at the controls, improvisation, nerve, and the knife-edge duel between hunter and hunted. Warhistory.org. The Americans, in their view, were industrial soldiers, mass-produced, mechanically competent, individually replaceable. Reports from the Eastern Front painted a picture of Soviet pilots thrown into the air with minimal training, fodder for German guns. It was easy to graft that image onto these new enemies from across the Atlantic, clumsy, overconfident, relying on radios and formations rather than instinct. The FW-190 was, in their hands, the answer. Here was a machine that married German engineering to the tactical instincts of their best men. Its armament, 4 20mm cannons, and 2 machine guns on most variants, had proved devastating against RAF fighters and could tear a bomber apart in a few seconds' burst. Against a single-engine fighter, one good pass was often enough. Wikipedia. They had seen P-47s shot down before. The big fighter could dive away at high speed, but once cornered, its bulk made it easy prey. So they told one another. They put faith in hard data. Gunnery tables that showed how long a 20mm shell took to cross so many meters, how many hits were needed to break a wing spar, how a fighter's frame buckled when the fuel lines along its spine were cut. In the briefing that afternoon, an officer tapped the root of the B-17s with a pointer and drew an arc where the German units would climb to intercept. He spoke of altitude, of the sun's position, of the precise angle from which to begin the diving attack that would punch through the Thunderbolt screen and reach the bombers. He spoke of fuel, of ammunition, of the time they could linger before breaking off. No one discussed what would happen if the calculations failed. The war had been built on the idea that Germany would strike first, strike harder, and break the enemy before the industrial balance turned against them. Even as the factories of the Ruhr and the cities around them burned under American and British bombing raids, the default assumption in rooms like this remained. One well-flown German fighter, in the hands of a veteran, was worth several of whatever the enemy brought. And whatever else the P-47 was, it was still just aluminum, wiring, and fluid. It would burn if you hit it often enough. The Thunderbolt that carried Robert Johnson over France that evening was a physical expression of a different set of assumptions. Back on Long Island, at the Republic Aviation plant in Farmingdale, engineers had started with the brutal reality of 1940-41. Any single-engine fighter that went to war over Europe would be shot at. A lot. Pilots would make mistakes. Metal would fail. If the machine couldn't absorb punishment and bring its pilot home more often than not, the air war over Germany would be lost before it began. So they built something that looked, even to American eyes, too big to be graceful. The P-47 was one of the heaviest single-seat fighters of the war, tipping the scales at up to 8 tons loaded. A massive Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial engine sat at its nose, feeding a 4-blade propeller that bit into the air with enough force to shove the jug to around 440 main kilometers in a dive. The wings carried 850 caliber machine guns, each with generous ammunition, because engineers and pilots alike understood that escorts would have to fight their way in and out, not simply make a single pass and go home. Wikipedia. Around the pilot, they wrapped steel in design choices. The cockpit's back wall was armor plate. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, built to swell and close around punctures. Control cables were routed with redundancy. Critical systems were distributed wherever possible, so that a single cannon shell would be less likely to sever everything at once. The airframe's sheer mass and robust construction were not elegant, but they were forgiving. Stories had begun to circulate even in 1943 of P-47s coming home with chunks missing from wings, with flak damage stitched across the fuselage, with cylinders shot out of the engine, yet still turning. Wikipedia. Behind each pilot sat not a cult of the individual ace, but a training and replacement system that, by mid-war, was approaching industrial scale. American fighter pilots typically logged close to 200 hours in trainers and operational aircraft before they ever saw combat, flying in structured phases that emphasized instrument flying, formation work, deflection shooting, and gunnery from standardized ranges. It was expensive, slow, and sometimes plodding, but it produced men who could slot into a squadron and operate within a coherent doctrine. WWII For the 8th Air Force in England, the P-47 was the first real attempt at an answer to a problem that had nearly broken the daylight bombing campaign in its first year. How to keep bombers alive deep over occupied Europe, where German fighters could pick their time and altitude. Early missions that lacked long-range escort had taken catastrophic losses. Even with fighters like the P-47, which initially lacked the range to follow the bombers all the way to distant targets, every mile of added escort coverage chipped away at the Luftwaffe's ability to mount free attacks. AmericanAirMuseum.com. The American solution was not subtle, it was arithmetic. By war's end, the United States would build 15,683 P-47s, more than any other U.S. fighter type, assembled in multiple factories that turned out aircraft around the clock. Each airframe was a unit in a vast equation that included replacement pilots, spare engines, and repair depots in England and on the continent. If one jug did not come back, another would take its place. If it did come back, however holed and battered, the pilot could fly again, bringing growing experience to bear on subsequent missions. Encyclopedia Britannica. In that structure, individual stories like Johnson's became test cases of a design philosophy. Could the aircraft take 20-plus cannon hits and remain controllable? Could its armor save a man from shrapnel at arm's length? Could a crippled machine still fly far enough to clear enemy territory and reach a field with a strip of concrete and a crash crew? The answers were written in peeling paint and bent aluminum, in the way maintenance men ran their hands over a returning fuselage and counted 1, 2, 50, 100 impact points. What neither the American engineers nor the Luftwaffe officers could fully model on a blackboard was what happened when those equations collided at a specific time and place. One Jagdwaffe pilot with a near-empty ammunition load, one Thunderbolt with its hydraulics bled out and its pilot half blinded by fluid, intersecting over occupied France with altitude, gravity, and human instinct doing their own silent calculations. Johnson brought half pint out of the spin low enough that the French countryside resolved into individual fields, hedgerows, thin roads lined with poplars. The cockpit stank of burnt paint and hydraulic oil. The wind tore through the jagged hole where part of the canopy had been, throwing tiny glass fragments around the cabin like grit. He pushed the nose gently up, trading speed for a slight gain in altitude, angling northwest toward the unseen line of the channel. The controls responded sluggishly, but responded. Somewhere, somehow, the P-47 was still talking to him through what was left of its cables and pistons. In the mirror mounted above the panel, he caught a flicker of movement. The FW-190 eased into view behind him, small at first, then larger, like a hunting bird closing on wounded prey. Its radial engine and wide wings were familiar from recognition manuals. This one carried the mottled camouflage of a frontline Jagdgeschwader, the canopy glinting as it rocked slightly in the turbulence. The first pass came in from astern and slightly high, a textbook attack. Johnson saw the tracers reach for him an instant before they struck. The airframe shook as 20mm rounds walked up from the tail toward the wings. He hunched lower behind the armor plate, instinctively trying to make himself smaller. Something banged against the seatback, a shell exploding in the steel just behind his head, close enough that the concussion rang in his skull. Wikipedia. There was nothing elegant about his evasive maneuvering. With the hydraulics compromised, the jug wallowed rather than rolled, and each kick on the rudder pedal sent delayed, uneven ripples through the tail. Still, angle and inertia had their own logic. Once, as the 190 slid in too close, Johnson jabbed the controls hard enough to force the German to overshoot. In that brief moment, he squeezed the trigger, sending a blind burst from his .850 caliber guns out into the fogged air, more defiance than calculated shot. The German made a second pass. More hits, more shuddering impacts, the sound of metal being torn open. The Thunderbolt kept flying. From the other cockpit, the scene would have been as strange as it was infuriating. A lone American fighter, already savaged, trailing scars of smoke and fluid, refusing to fall. The Jagdwaffe pilot was no novice. To fly at this altitude, in this unit, in 1943, he likely had dozens of missions behind him, perhaps scores of combat hours. His gun camera footage would normally show clean kills, enemy aircraft breaking, burning, spinning earthward after one or two well-placed bursts. Here, every rule of thumb failed. 21 cannon shells had already punched into the Thunderbolt's fuselage and wings. Now the German poured machine gun fire into the American from wingtip to wingtip as he closed in for the coup de grace, working the rudder to sweep his tracers across every part of the jug's airframe. Wikipedia. And still it flew. Slower. Lower. But its propeller turned. Its wings held. Its pilot remained stubbornly inside that armored box. At some point in that sequence, the German eased his fighter up alongside the P-47 instead of behind it. The two aircraft hung in rough formation over occupied ground, their pilots just meters apart, separated by canopy glass and language and the churn of air over scarred metal. Johnson turned his head and saw his enemy for the first time, not as a set of tracers and a muzzle flash, but as a man in another cockpit, helmeted, goggled, looking back at him. Hydraulic fluid had streaked his own face, smearing everything with a slick sheen. He later remembered the other pilot's expression as something between disbelief and a kind of grudging respect. The FW-190 rocked its wings, a small, unmistakable gesture, a salute. Then it rolled away, dropped behind, and came in for yet another pass. By the third such exchange, the pattern had become surreal. Attack. Damage. No kill. A close pass, the other pilot staring, saluting, breaking away. Whether it was the same man running his guns dry or more than one aircraft sharing the work, accounts would differ after the war. One version of the story, drawn from Johnson's own memoir and later analysis, suggested that the final attacker might have been an ace from a neighboring Jagdgeschwader, perhaps Egon Meyer of JG2, though post-war research never confirmed the identity. Wikipedia. What remained consistent in all tellings was the outcome. Eventually, the Germans' ammunition truly ran out. There were no more shells to feed into the cannons, no more belts of 900 2mm rounds rattling through the gun bays. He formed up one last time on the P-47's wing, gave a final rocking of his wings, acknowledgement, frustration, perhaps a professional nod to an opponent and to a machine that had cheated the normal arithmetic of air combat, and then turned back toward his own lines. Johnson was alone again. The channel appeared at last as a shifting band of gray off the nose, then widened. The engine kept turning. The hydraulic system, ravaged by earlier hits, gave him no flaps and little in the way of reliable brakes, but the control surfaces did just enough. Ground control in England, talking him in by radio, guided his limping aircraft toward Manston's runway. On final, The Thunderbolt came in hotter than normal, nose high, sink rate heavy. He coaxed the last usable response out of the elevators, flared as much as he could, and let the jug meet the concrete in a long, grinding touchdown. Without full braking, the aircraft rolled for what felt like forever. It finally shuddered to a stop halfway down the strip, smoke trickling from the gun ports, tires protesting under the weight. Wikipedia. Crash trucks and ambulances were already moving, sirens wailing. Ground crewmen ran alongside as Johnson shut down what was left of the ER-2800. The silence after he cut the mixture was almost as shocking as the artillery-like impacts had been earlier. He fumbled with the harness, tried the canopy again, found it still immovably jammed. Men scrambled up onto the wing with fire axes and pry bars, working at the twisted frame until they could drag it enough for him to squeeze out. They took him to the hospital with burns on his face and hands, shrapnel in his leg, ears ringing. Later, stiff and bandaged but upright, he insisted on walking back out to see what remained of Half Pint. Up close, in the fading light, the jug no longer looked like a warplane so much as a punched-through practice target. The metal skin was peppered with holes. Johnson started counting, running his fingers along the fuselage, muttering the numbers under his breath. He reached 200 without even circling the aircraft and stopped, shaking his head. The armor plate behind his seat bore the deep craters of several 20-millimeter impacts, no more than an inch or two from where his spine had been. The propeller blades showed the neat, obscene holes where smaller calibers had passed, clean through. Real history. Someone, looking at the pattern of damage, called the plane a sieve. The official records of the 56th Fighter Group for that day told a harsher story written in simpler numbers. 4 pilots from the group killed, another down in the channel, several aircraft destroyed or so badly damaged they would never fly again. On the German side, claims submitted for that engagement ran into double digits. By the rough, brutal accounting of June 1943, the Luftwaffe had won the day tactically. Wikipedia. Yet somewhere in those same numbers, another kind of math had begun to assert itself. Even in isolation, the duel over Forges-les-Eaux was not just a personal drama. It was a sample point in a graph that stretched across years and thousands of sorties. On the German side, the FW-190 represented one of the pinnacles of Axis fighter design. Agile, powerful, capable of both air superiority and ground attack. Over 20,000 would be built in total by war's end, an impressive figure for a country fighting on multiple fronts under increasing bombardment. Yet the conditions of that production were steadily worsening. Factories dispersed or buried, assembly lines disrupted by bombing raids, fuel stocks dwindling. Wikipedia. Pilot training, too, was being squeezed. In the early war years, Luftwaffe fighter pilots might log 250 hours of flight training before going to the front. By 1943, and especially into 1944, that figure dropped dramatically, in some cases to barely more than 100 hours, as fuel shortages and attrition forced the system to push men through faster. Experienced aces remained at the front until they were killed or incapacitated. Their skill compensated for the declining quality of replacements, but they could not be in 2 cockpits at once, and every loss was irreplaceable. Warhistory.org. Across the channel, the United States was running its own numbers. The Thunderbolt line alone produced 15,683 fighters between 1941 and 1945, with American industry able to shift production among plants to make up losses. Of those P-47s, roughly 2/3 reached overseas commands. About 5,000 would be lost, a sobering figure that nonetheless represented a smaller proportion of total production than the Luftwaffe could sustain. Encyclopedia Britannica. Pilot training pipelines in the U.S. Army Air Forces, while not immune to pressures, maintained higher average flying hours and benefited from greater access to fuel and aircraft. A fighter pilot might expect around 200 hours of training flight time before joining a frontline unit, and those who survived their tours often rotated home to instruct, feeding experience back into the system rather than leaving it all at the front. The result was a broader base of competent pilots and a slower degradation of overall quality. WWII.net. The design of aircraft like the P-47 folded into this equation in a specific way. Survivability did not just save machines, it saved trained men. Every pilot who limped back in a battered jug rather than going down in flames represented hundreds of thousands of dollars in training costs preserved, dozens of missions yet to be flown, and accumulating tactical knowledge that could be shared in briefings and debriefings. A fighter that could soak up catastrophic damage and still return to base shifted the attrition curve by small but relentless increments. Robert Johnson's near-fatal sortie illustrated that point with brutal clarity. Rough estimates based on his later account and damage assessments suggested that Half Pint had taken at least 21 20mm cannon hits and hundreds of smaller bullets. In most fighters of the era, especially those with liquid-cooled inline engines and lighter construction, even a fraction of that punishment would have meant disintegration or fire. In the Thunderbolt, it meant a barely controlled descent and a marginal, but real, chance of making it back. Radial. On any given day in 1943, individual combats could go either way. German pilots still racked up kills, and American units still wrote letters home explaining why certain names would no longer appear on the roster. But as production, training, and aircraft design interacted over time, the trend lines moved in one direction. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Luftwaffe's ability to mass large, well-flown formations of fighters over the bombers' routes dwindled. Each veteran lost took with him not just a tally of kills, but irreplaceable experience. Each returning Thunderbolt brought back a pilot who was a little more seasoned, a little less likely to make the mistakes that got men killed. The mathematics of defeat for Germany in the air war did not hinge on a single mission or on a single duel between a Jug and a Würger. It resided in the way numbers like 15,683 and 20,000 interacted with numbers like 200 flight hours versus 10, with the percentage of pilots who survived their first 5 sorties, with the tonnage of aviation fuel available per month. When those figures were run forward long enough, the outcome was not in doubt. Encyclopedia Britannica. What Johnson's bullet-riddled return did was put a human face and a specific tail number on that cold arithmetic. In the years that followed, Robert S. Johnson returned to the air quickly. Within days of his June 26th ordeal, his burns bandaged and the shrapnel wounds clotting into scars, he was flying again with the 56th Fighter Group. By the end of his tour, he would be credited with 27 aerial victories, surpassing Eddie Rickenbacker's First World War record and becoming one of the leading American aces in the European theater. Wikipedia. The story of Dessau, Half Pint's survival, made the rounds in squadron bars and official histories alike. It fit the Allied narrative in ways that were hard to ignore. The ruggedness of American engineering, the endurance of individual pilots, the idea that, in this war, the machines and the men inside them could absorb punishment that would have destroyed an earlier generation. For ground crew, it was a point of pride that their work, invisible once the aircraft left the runway, had helped keep a mangled set of systems functioning just long enough. On the German side, incidents like this, where an opponent refused to die on schedule, contributed to a quieter shift in perception. Reports filtered back from pilots who had expended entire ammunition loads on bombers that struggled but did not fall, on fighters that came back again and again. Even the most committed believers in German technical superiority had to reckon with the fact that the enemy was not only numerous, but increasingly durable. For the men who had actually been there that day, Johnson in his cockpit, the unknown Jagdwaffe pilot in his FW-190, The legacy was more personal. Both had done what they were trained to do. Both had trusted their machines. Both had seen, up close, the thinness of the line between survival and falling out of the sky. Decades later, when historians and enthusiasts ran their fingers over restored P-47s in museums, they sometimes pointed out the armor plate behind the pilot's seat, the thickness of the wing spars, the self-sealing tanks. They spoke of war in the language of tensile strength and impact angles. Visitors reading the plaques might see a photograph of a young man from Oklahoma standing in front of a jug with victory marks painted under the canopy rail, and know, in a vague way, that he had come back from something extraordinary. Real history, the real weight of the story sat elsewhere, in the knowledge that for every dramatic, almost unbelievable escape, there were countless others who did not make it back, and that the eventual outcome of the air war owed as much to logistics and production schedules as it did to courage. On that afternoon in 1943, over French fields and a gray strip of water, a single P-47 violated the expectations of both sides long enough to write itself into the margins of history. The image that remains, if you strip away the commentary and the statistics, is simple enough. A huge, scarred fighter dragging itself across the sky, smoke trailing, canopy crazed with cracks, its pilot half blinded and bruised, and a German fighter sliding up alongside, rocking its wings in a brief, silent acknowledgement before turning away. For a moment, the war narrowed to that thin slice of air between them, to two men separated by inches of glass, and two very different sets of assumptions about what should and should not be possible. Then the Thunderbolt kept going, and the calculus of the wider war resumed, relentless as gravity.